The black ships arrived at dawn. They did not announce themselves with horns or banners. They simply appeared through the fog. 3 dark hulls riding low on water the color of iron, their sails the deep green of the sea pack. A color that meant the ocean had sent something that would not be refused. Liora stood on the Black Harbor dock beside her husband and said nothing. That was not unusual. She had never said much in the land court. Not because she lacked thought. She carried more thought than most rooms could hold. But because the land pack link did not carry her voice the way it carried an alpha's command. And a court that could not hear something tended to forget it was speaking. She was 25 years old, young enough that some counselors still look through her when they address the king, old enough to understand exactly what the treaty Lord Cassivar was reading aloud from his silver-edged scroll would mean for her. The sea pack will lend its full northern fleet, 40 warships and the tide captains who commanded them, to the Land Kingdom's coastal defense. In exchange, the Luna of the Land Throne will reside at Moontide Palace as living guarantee of the Alliance. Living guarantee. That was the phrase. 2 words that meant something clean and formal, like an official seal. 2 words that did not sound like what they were. The court had spent 3 days deciding Leora's value. She had heard them through the thin walls of the War Council chamber. She had heard Cassivar's voice most clearly, that dry, careful voice that always sounded like it was reading from a ledger, because it usually was. She cannot use alpha speech. She cannot project command. She cannot raise her voice in battle council. What strategic value does she hold beside the king? No one had answered that question in her defense, not even Theron. She had waited for him to speak. She had stood in the corridor outside the council door, with her fingers pressed to the cold stone wall, and waited. The silence that came back to her was a different kind than her own. Her silence held things, his held absence. Now the treaty was being read aloud in the gray morning air, and the black ships waited, and Liora unfastened the moonshell necklace from her throat. The shells were small, pale half-translucent, things she had collected from every harbor she had ever visited, things she pressed to her ear not for comfort, as the court assumed, but because the dead spoke through them if you were quiet enough to listen. The wives of drowned soldiers, the pups who went under in foreign tides, the old sea wolves whose bones lay on the bottom of channels no one charted anymore. She placed the necklace in Theron's hand. He looked down at it, then at her. His golden eyes carried something she recognized, not indifference, never indifference, but the particular exhaustion of a man who has already made a decision he knows will cost him, and cannot find a way to unmake it. She said the only words she chose to give him. One day, you will need a voice the land cannot hear. Then she walked to the ship. Behind her, Cassivar's voice resumed, something about ratification schedules and fleet delivery windows. She did not listen. She kept her eyes on the gangplank, on the dark water below, on the way the harbor surface moved in small, restless patterns that no wind could explain. Her foot touched the deck. The harbor went silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that has weight and intention. The kind that does not happen by accident. Every wave smoothed flat. Every gull stopped mid-cry and sat. The harbor bells, which had been ringing in the wind since before sunrise, went still as if hands had closed around them. The sea-pack sailors looked at each other. One of them took a step back. Liora stood on the deck of the black ship and breathed. Below the surface, far below the dark harbor water, something moved. Long shapes, silver-lit and enormous. Wolf shapes, but made of current and deep pressure. Things that had no business being this close to shore. They had come to meet her. She could feel them the way she felt shells against her ear. Not sound, exactly, but vibration. Memory, recognition. One word moved through the water like a tide pulling back before a wave, returned. On the dock, Captain Orin of the land fleet touched Theron's arm. "My lord," he said quietly, "the sea has gone still." Cassivar waved a hand. Tide omen, coastal superstition. Theron did not move. He stood with the moonshell necklace in his fist and watched the ship pull away from the dock, and he did not call out, and he did not follow, and the harbor remained silent long after the green sails disappeared into the fog. Moontide Palace was carved into black cliffs beneath a lighthouse, so old the stone had turned the color of bone. The Sea Pack had built it in the age before land kingdoms claimed the coasts, before anyone tried to draw borders across water, which had always been a kind of madness since water moved. The palace was not grand in the way land courts were grand. It did not have high ceilings designed to make visitors feel small. It had low arched doorways worn smooth by salt wind, and floors inlaid with tide chart patterns, and windows that looked directly into the open sea, so that whoever sat in the great hall always knew what the ocean was doing. Sea Alpha Merrick met her at the harbor steps. He was a large man, dark-haired, with the kind of stillness that comes not from restraint but from genuine calm. The stillness of someone who has spent years reading weather and knows that patience is not the same as passivity. He was not what Liora had expected. She had expected a warlord who had agreed to a hostage transaction and intended to make use of his leverage. He stepped forward. He opened his mouth. Then the ocean wolves rose. They came from the water on both sides of the harbor steps, enormous translucent shapes, silver light moving through waveform, eyes like moons seen from depth, 6 of them. Then 12. Then more, pressing up behind the first, crowding the shallows with cold luminescence. Every Seaftac wolf on the dock dropped to one knee. Merrick looked at the shapes in the water, then at Liora. Then he knelt too. "The land," he said carefully, "sent us a hostage." He raised his head and met her eyes. "The sea returned us a queen." Liora stood very still in her pale traveling cloak and let the words settle around her. She had spent 25 years in a court that could not hear her. She had spent those same years learning not to need to be heard, because needing things from people who cannot give them is a particular kind of slow suffering she had decided to stop performing. She was not certain how to receive this. She would learn. Back on land, the court did not learn. It celebrated. The 40 Sea-Pack ships moved into position along the northern coast, and Cassivar made a speech about strategic wisdom, and the council drank dark wine and called it victory, and Theron sat at the head of the table and did not drink. That night, he sat at the harbor and let himself think the name he had been avoiding. Liora. He thought about the way she had pressed the necklace into his hand without crying. He thought about the line she had given him. "One day you will need a voice the land cannot hear," and the way it had sounded more like prophecy than farewell. He thought about the harbor going silent. He thought about Captain Orin's face. He did not sleep. And when sleep finally took him near dawn, it brought something that was not quite a dream. It brought Liora standing far below the surface of dark water, her hair unbound, her eyes open, perfectly calm. Around her, the drowned wolf shapes circled. Their mouths moved without sound, but the tide carried the words up anyway. He sold the voice that could have saved him. Theron woke with salt on his lips and the moonshell necklace still in his fist. Lady Nerissa found Liora on the tide walk the morning after her arrival, a narrow path of stone that ran along the base of the cliffs where the waves ran in and out, sometimes knee-deep, sometimes dry, depending on what the sea wanted. Nerissa was the sea pack's moon priestess. She was old in the way coastal stone was old, not fragile, but shaped by long exposure to things that eroded softness. She carried shells on a cord at her belt, and they made a sound when she walked that was almost music. She sat beside Liora on a wet stone and watched the tide come in. "You have been collecting shells since childhood," she said. It was not a question. Liora nodded. "You press them to your ear to hear the sea." "To hear the dead," Liora said. It was the most she had said to anyone in days. Nerissa did not react with surprise. She simply looked at the water. On land, they called that morning practice widow ritual, harmless superstition. Yes, they were wrong. Nerissa turned to look at her. "What you hear in the shells is not memory, it is language. The same language your voice carries. The land wolves cannot receive it because it travels below their pack link frequency, but the sea hears it," Liora said quietly. Nerissa nodded once. "You were never silent, child. You were simply speaking to the wrong kingdom." That night, Liora sat alone in the tide chamber, a round room open to the ocean on one side, where the water came in at high tide and receded to leave patterns in the sand. And she did something she had not done since she was a girl. She let her voice out without shaping it for land ears. It was not singing. It was not speech. It was something below both. A vibration that started in her chest and moved outward, and the shells on the walls answered it, and the water in the chamber stirred, and far outside the palace walls, the ocean wolves lifted their heads. She had not known until that moment how long she had been holding her breath. On land, Theron went looking for answers in the old records. He told himself it was strategic research, understanding tide voice to better plan alliance terms. He told himself that 3 times in a row, which was usually a sign that something was not entirely true. He found what he was looking for in the coastal archives, buried beneath flood damage maps from his father's failed coast war. A prophecy. Old enough that the parchment it was written on had gone the color of dried seaweed. When land sells silence to the sea, the tide will crown what the throne could not hear. He sat with that sentence for a long time. Then he went and found Cassivar. "The prophecy," Theron said. "You hit it." Cassivar did not deny it. He simply looked at Theron with the expression of a man who has planned for this conversation. "It is a coastal myth. Ancient superstition. You hit it. I protected the treaty." Theron looked at the man who had spent 3 days in the War Council measuring Liora's worth, and found her acceptable as payment. He said nothing. Some silences, he was learning, were their own kind of answer. He went to Captain Oren. When the harbor went silent, he said, "What did you see?" Oren was quiet for a moment. "The sea held still for her," he said at last. "I have been sailing for 18 years. I have seen storms stop and tides turn and lights in the water that no one could explain. But I have never seen the sea hold still for a person." He paused. "We took the ships. But the sea went quiet the moment she stepped aboard." Theron returned to his chambers and stood at the window that faced north. He had made a decision. He had called it political necessity. He had called it sacrifice. He had let a man who measured women by their command volume write a treaty and had signed it because the alternative was a coastal war his kingdom might not survive, and he had learned from his father's failure that survival sometimes meant paying costs you could not name cleanly. He understood all of that. He still understood all of that. What he had not understood, standing in the harbor watching green sails take his Luna into fog, was that the cost he could not name cleanly was not his to pay. Then the message came from the fleet captains. The northern ships had begun to show signs of damage no weather explained. Bell housings cracking, anchor chains snapping in still water, ropes fraying overnight, and a sound, several captains reported it independently. A low sound beneath the waves at night, like something very large turning over in deep water. Captain Oren sent the letter that settled it. The sea is asking for something. I do not know the word for what it is asking, but I know we do not have it. Theron sent Liora a royal message, formal language, carefully worded, a request for her temporary return to provide strategic consultation. The reply arrived 3 days later in the form of the moonshell necklace, packed in a box of sea salt and dark kelp. When Theron held a shell to his ear, he heard her voice for the first time without a room full of council noise drowning it out, clear as tide, steady as stone. "You did not ask me to leave," she said. "You sent me." He sat with the shell in his hand for a long time. Then he ordered a ship prepared. The sea pack had not expected him so quickly. Merrick met him at the outer harbor gate. Not inside the tide circle, but before it, where the stone path ended and the water began, and a pale line of shells marked the boundary between ordinary land and whatever came after. "You may not pass the tide circle without her invitation," Merrick said. Not rudely, simply as a fact, the way one might state that fire was hot or that winter came after autumn. Theron looked past him to where Liora stood on the steps of Moontide Palace, at the far end of the stone path, on the seaside of the tide circle. She wore dark blue now, not the pale silver of land court. Her hair was unbound and salt damp. The broken moonshell necklace hung at her throat. She had restrung it herself, he realized, with sea cord. She was calm in a way she had never been permitted to be in the land court. He had given her that, at least, by accident. The ocean wolves lay in the shallows behind her, translucent shapes rising and falling with the water's breath. He said, "I came to ask for help." Her answer came across the water without her raising her voice. "No. You came because ships sink louder than women." One of his guards inhaled sharply. Theron did not signal for silence. He deserved to feel the shape of those words without cushioning. He tried the private approach. He asked to speak with her alone. Merrick looked to Liora. She inclined her head. They met on the stone bridge above the tide, not quite shore and not quite sea. He told her he had been wrong, that he had let the council define her worth and should not have, that he had allowed fear of a coastal war to make him accept terms he should have refused. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "You were wrong before witnesses." He waited. "You will not be sorry in private and saved in public." The tide lifted against the stones beneath them. He felt the vibration of it in his boots. Merrick had told him before the meeting. There was a condition. The tide circle would not open to him as Alpha King. It would only open when he named what he had done without the language of kings. No sacrifice, no necessity, no living guarantee, no political currency, the plain word. Theron could not say it, not yet. He stood on the stone bridge with the open sea on one side and his waiting escort on the other, and could not get the word through the part of his mind that had spent 30 years being raised to believe that what a king chose to do was, by definition, a decision, not a transaction. He returned to his ship without passing the tide circle. That night, the storm came. He heard it before he saw it. Not thunder, but a low harmonic groan from the north, the kind of sound that traveled through water and wood rather than air. By morning, the sky above the fleet channel had turned the color of a bruise, and the captains were sending signal fires, and Captain Oren's voice was in his ear, saying the ships were trapped and the storm walls were not moving, and something was circling in the water below. Liora, inside the palace, pressed her ear to the oldest shell she had found on the tidewalk. The drowned came to her in pieces, voices from salt and depth, men who had gone down in the channel generations ago. Wolf-blood sailors who had never received sea rights because the land kings they served had not known to give them. Soldiers from her father-in-law's failed coast war, the one Theron had inherited as wound and warning, and beneath all of them, the older dead, women, some taken across the tide as hostages and never returned, some given as fleet payment in wars older than memory, some who had simply been traded because their silence made them seem replaceable. The storm was not weather, it was history, and it had been sleeping until Liora's sail woke it, because her sail was not the first of its kind. It was only the most recent. She found Theron's fleet captain through the shell, reached her voice out below the storm frequency, below the pack link, into the deep current where Tide voice traveled and told him one thing: tell the king the sea is asking for truth, not strategy, not command. Truth. Oren's final message arrived wrapped in waterproof cloth and delivered by a sea-pack messenger running full speed. It said exactly what she had said. The sea is asking for truth. Theron read it standing on the harbor steps with the stormlight turning everything the color of old iron. Then he walked to the tide circle. He stood at its edge for a long time. Liora came down the palace steps and stood on the other side of the pale shell line. Behind her, the ocean wolves moved silently through the shallows, eyes like cold stars. He could feel the word he needed, sitting in his chest like a stone. I sold her, he said. It came out barely above a whisper. The tide circle flickered, a faint luminescence along the shells, there and then gone. Liora looked at him. Whispering it to the sea does not break a curse built on public law. He understood. He had understood since she said not sorry in private. He had simply hoped, in the way of someone who has never been truly accountable in a room full of people, that perhaps partial truth might be enough. It was not. Merrick convened the Tide Assembly the next morning. Every sea-pack captain and elder gathered on the cliff steps, facing the sea. Theron stood before them, outside the circle, with his land escort at the harbor edge and the storm on the northern horizon, and nothing between him and consequence. Liora stood inside the circle, with the ocean wolves at her back, and the moonshell necklace at her throat, and her face as composed as still water. Theron held out his hand. She placed a shell in his palm. The largest one, the one through which she had spoken across the distance between them. When he held it to his lips, both land court and sea pack would hear what he said. He understood that. He accepted it, he said. I called it sacrifice because sale sounded too much like the truth. His voice carried through the shell and through the tide and through the pack link of two kingdoms at once. Land and sea, north coast and harbor council. Every captain in the trapped fleet hearing it through salt wind. I traded my Luna's freedom for ships. I let my council name her silence useless because I was afraid to lose a war. I signed a treaty that turned a person into payment without asking her consent. And I called it political necessity because I could not look at what I had done and call it what it was. He lowered the shell. I will not ask the sea to save what my betrayal purchased until the law that allowed it is broken. The tide circle opened with a sound like a wave releasing from stone. Slow and final, and without drama, the way real things changed. At land court, Cassivar had heard every word through the pack-link current. He moved immediately. He sent urgent word to council loyalists. The king had lost composure. The king was being manipulated by a sea witch. Emergency War Authority needed to be convened before the Northern Fleet was lost entirely. What he had not accounted for was that the shell carried both ways. every lord and captain who had wondered about the altered fleet route and the missing prophecy and the treaty clauses that gave Cassivar extraordinary authority in the event of naval disaster, now had those questions answered in very plain language. Not by Theron. By the records that Cassivar's own clerks, frightened of what was coming, began producing. The altered route maps, the hidden prophecy scroll, the drafts of previous hostage treaties he had authored, the emergency authority documents waiting to be signed. Cassivar was arrested before nightfall. In the storm channel, the fleet held. The ocean wolves had been circling since the storm began, not because they could not help, but because the treaty that created the fleet's existence was still unnamed. Now Liora stepped into the tide and let her voice fall below speech, below song, into the vibration the sea was made of. She did not command, she called. And the dead answered first, the ones who had needed someone to name them before they could let go. The soldiers from the old Coast War, the hostages taken in older treaties, the women traded across tides in wars so old no one had written them down. Liora named them, not by individual names because she did not know them all, but she named what had been done to them, and naming it clearly was enough, because the storm did not require punishment, it required recognition. Theron came to stand beside her at the tide line. He did not lead. He listened to the shape of what she was doing and followed it, repeated what she said, gave the sea rights to the drowned as she directed, named the betrayals she named in the language of land kings, so both kingdoms received the truth simultaneously. The storm walls began to move. Not quickly, not all at once. The sea does not forgive on a schedule, but by midday, gaps opened in the storm. The ocean wolves formed tide walls, enormous translucent shapes pressing the worst of the water away from the fleet, holding corridors of calm through which the ships could move. By evening, every ship was free. Liora stood on the sea-throne steps and watched them go. She did not board any of them. She had not been asked to, and she would not have gone if asked. The sea was not finished with her. She was not finished with the sea. Theron remained at Black Harbor for 3 more days. He reformed hostage bride law on the 2nd day, reading the decree into the tide wind so both kingdoms heard it simultaneously. No Luna, mate, bride, sister, daughter, widow, or woman could be offered as political guarantee. Consent was required for all alliance residency. Hostage treaties involving mates were void and could not be renewed. Women sent across borders retained full legal personhood and right of refusal. Living guarantees could not be demanded as fleet payment. Every old hostage record would be reviewed. Sea rights would be given to those lost under forced treaties. Cassivar's emergency authority documents were burned. His alternate fleet routes were replaced. His hidden prophecy was published in full, copied to both land and sea archives. On the 3rd day, Theron stood at the harbor edge and asked if Liora would come home. She had come down to the outer dock to hear the question herself. She stood at the edge of the tide, not crossing it, not retreating from it. She said, "Home is where my voice is heard." He had no argument. He had used all his arguments on the truth and had nothing left that was not honest. "May I stand with the sea pack?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. He was 25 years old. Young enough that he would have time, if he chose to spend it correctly, to become something different from what he had been. Old enough to know that choosing correctly was harder than wanting to. "You may stand at the harbor," she said. "When the tide chooses to let you cross, you will know." He nodded. He did not push for more. He had learned, in 3 days at the edge of the tide circle, that demanding entry to something sacred did not make you worthy of it. He went back to land. He began the long work of rebuilding a court that could hear voices it had been trained to dismiss. He established council interpreters for silent and nonverbal wolves. He revised land court protocol so that written communication, sign language, and non-alpha forms of addressing the throne were given equal standing. He reviewed the names of every coastal widow the court had ever categorized as having no strategic value and found, in several cases, that they had been warning him about things the court then suffered from years later. It was slow work. It was right work. He came back to Black Harbor 1 month later. No crown, no formal escort. He brought nothing except the moonshell necklace, repaired, restrung on new silver cord, the shells cleaned and intact, and he placed it on the dock stones without trying to give it to her. It was not his to give back. It had been hers all along. He sat on the dock edge and waited. The tide came in. When it receded, Liora stood on the wet stones where the water had been, dressed in sea-dark blue, her feet bare, ocean wolves resting in the shallows behind her like a living tide. She looked at the necklace, then at him. "You kept it. I listened to it," he said. "Every night for a month. I heard things I should have heard years ago." She picked up the necklace. She did not put it on. She held it in her hand. "Then keep listening," she said. He stayed until the tide turned. The new treaty between Moontide Palace and the Land Kingdom took 3 months to negotiate because Liora negotiated it herself and she was not in a hurry. The Seapack fleet became an ally by choice, not by purchase. Every clause in the alliance was reviewed by both Liora and Merrick before Theron signed it. The Stormcurse records were archived in both palace libraries as permanent record of what hostage treaties cost. Liora ruled Moontide Palace as Tide Queen. She did not rule quietly. She ruled through tide readings, through shell councils, through the words she sent across the water to captains who had learned to listen below the range of alpha speech. She was not a hostage. She was not a Luna borrowed by the sea. She was the sea's own. Lady Nerissa said it best, and only once. Silence is only emptiness to those who worship noise. A young girl came before the Land Council in autumn. She had been born mute, seaborn, brought inland by a coastal family. The old court would have spent 10 minutes deciding what use she was, and finding no satisfying answer. Theron did not speak first. He waited. He looked toward the sea window. He had not made a habit of asking Liora to be present for council sessions. She had her own kingdom to run, but she had come this time because the tide had told her something needed hearing. She stood in the council doorway in dark blue, calm and still. She walked to the girl. She reached into her cloak pocket and placed a shell in the small cupped hands. The harbor outside the window went still. Not silent, still. The way water went stills when something moved through it very slowly and very deliberately. The girl raised the shell to her ear. Her expression shifted. Something opening that had been held closed for a long time. The council listened. None of them had the language for what they were witnessing. But they leaned forward anyway, the way people lean toward something when they understand instinctively that they should pay attention even before they know why. That was enough. That was the beginning of enough. At dawn the following morning, Theron stood on Black Harbor Dock. He was not crossing. He had not been invited to cross, and he did not presume. He simply stood at the edge of the tide in the gray early light and looked north. The ocean wolves rose slowly from the harbor water, 6 of them, then more, silver-lit and enormous, moving in the unhurried way of things that have existed longer than the kingdoms built along their shores. They came close enough to shore that the water around Theron's boots turned pale with their light. Behind them, far out on the tide, Liora stood. She was not walking toward him. She was not walking away. She stood on the water the way the ocean wolves stood, as if she had always belonged there and was simply allowing him to see it. The moonshell necklace caught the dawn light. He stood at the harbor and waited. He did not know what the tide would decide. He did not know how long he would stand there. He knew only that standing there was the correct thing. Not strategic. Not calculated, not sacrifice called by a different name, simply correct. The ocean did not owe him an answer. He was learning to be comfortable with that. The Alpha King had sold his silent Luna because he thought silence meant she had nothing to offer. But when the ocean wolves rose from the deep and bent their silver heads, and the sea that had gone still for her in a harbor full of witnesses chose her as its queen, he finally understood what he had given away. She had never been voiceless. He had simply belonged to a kingdom that did not know how to listen. And now, standing at the edge of a tide that would move when it chose and not before, he was finally beginning to learn. The tide came in while he waited, and went out and came in again. He counted 3 full cycles before he made himself stop counting and simply stood. A fishing boat moved through the harbor behind him. Its captain nodded without slowing. No one asked the Land King what he was doing at the dock in the cold morning air, with his boots wet and no crown on his head. Perhaps they already knew. The Sea Pack had sent 2 of its priestesses to land court the previous week. The first time in generations that the tide circle had opened outward, toward land, rather than drawing inward for protection. They had come to review the hostage records. They had come quietly, with scrolls and ink, and they had worked in the archive rooms for 4 days without ceremony. On the last evening, one of them had found Theron in the hallway outside the War Council chamber. She had not said anything at first. She had simply placed a small shell in his hand. When he held it to his ear, he heard nothing, only the tide, which was always the same sound no matter how many times you heard it. He had asked what it meant. The priestess had thought about it. It means she has not closed the current, she said, which is not the same as opening it. But it is not nothing. He had held onto that. Not nothing. In a situation defined by the weight of what had been done wrong, not nothing was a beginning. He stood at Black Harbor with cold water around his boots and held on to it still.